Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little from mypokercoaching.com, and today we are going to be discussing 10 tips for playing 3-bet pots as the preflop caller. So very specifically, this is when you raise before the flop, someone yet to act re-raises, which is also called a 3-bet, everyone else folds to you, and then you call. You can be either in position or out of position in this scenario, depending on where the 3-better came from. This is a very difficult spot for you because you would have re-raised if you had your best hands like aces, kings, queens, jacks, and ace king, which means you don't have those hands in your range all that often, whereas your opponent who re-raised before the flop will. So this is going to result in you lacking a lot of the very obvious best hands from your range, and your opponent will have them in their range, which means they are very often going to be favored on a lot of flops, which also means they're going to be betting into you a lot of the time. So you're going to have to figure out how to deal with aggression in these situations with a range disadvantage. It's a tough spot that you will find yourself in over and over and over again. And in this video, we're going to be going through 10 tips to help you navigate these spots well. Tip number 1 is to call often from in position on connected flops. So when will you be in position? This is when you raise, and then either the small blind or the big blind re-raises, and then you call. And then they continuation bet on the flop. When the flop is connected, meaning there is a straight draw, or a flush draw, or maybe 3 to a straight already on the flop, you will naturally have a lot of made hands and draws because you're going to call the 3-bet with a lot of suited aces, suited connectors, high cards, etc. You're going to have something very often on these boards. This will allow you to call with a pretty wide range in position and see what develops on the turn. For example, suppose you raise the cutoff, the small blind 3-bets, and you call, and the flop comes 8-7-3 with 2 hearts. They continuation bet, and in this scenario, you call. On 8-7-3, what would be a pretty weak hand to call with? Well, say you had Queen Jack with a backdoor flush draw. Say it's 8-7-3 with 2 hearts, 1 club. If you have Queen Jack of clubs, you should be calling, even though you just have 2 overcards. With the backdoor straight draw and backdoor flush draw, though, you get to stick around. And then, if your opponent checks the turn, even if you don't really turn much equity at all, say the turn's like a 6, 8-7-3-6. If they check, you need to be bluffing. Why? Because if they have a hand like ace-king on the turn, they're just going to fold. Same thing with king-queen, ace-x, whatever. You're going to be able to bet in this spot and make them fold out a lot of hands that you are behind. When you are in position, you need to be calling decently often on connected boards because in addition to having a lot of obviously strong hands like 3 of a kinds, some overpairs, some top pairs, and some draws, you're also going to have some junky draws that can pick up the pot when your opponent shows weakness on the turn. When your opponent has nothing, they're usually going to check. That allows you to bet, and you're going to get to pick up a lot of pots that many players simply fold away on the flop immediately. Also, you're going to find that in 3-bet pots, when your opponent's continuation bet, they often use a somewhat small size, which is going to give you very good pot odds. And when you're getting good pot odds, you need to stick around. We'll discuss that more later. Tip number 2 is to slow play your best hands, especially from in position. And this is because the stack to pot ratio is somewhat shallow in 3-bet pots. Say you raise to 2 big blinds, your opponent makes it 7 big blinds from out of position, and you call. Okay? At this point, the pot already has something like 15 big blinds in it. If you're playing 50 big blinds deep in a tournament, well, it means you only have, 43 big blinds more on the flop. If they bet 6 big blinds and you call, the pot's already up to, 27, 28 big blinds? Right? So we don't have a whole lot left remaining in our stack, so we don't need to raise immediately to get money in the pot. So say you do flop a very strong hand like 3 of a kind or 2 pair, you do not want to raise because you want to keep your opponent in the pot. If they're sitting there with ace high and you have 2 pair, they're drawing almost dead. Not totally dead, sometimes they're going to get there on you, but they're drawing pretty much dead. And you want to keep your opponent in when you are drawing dead. This also has the huge added benefit of protecting your calling range, which again will allow you to call flop bets a little bit wider compared to if you instead raise with all good hands. Like that previous example on the 8-7-3 board. If you have pocket 7s, you do not want to raise on the flop, especially from in position. And if your opponent checks the turn, well, they're checking the turn because sometimes you're going to be sitting there with pocket sevens. If they know they don't have to worry about pocket sevens because you'd always raise it, well, then that lets it be to where they can bet a little bit more often on the turn because they don't have to worry about running into your nuts, which means you're not going to get those bluffing opportunities with the random queen jack overcards like we just discussed. So make sure you call with a lot of your strongest hands, especially those that are the least vulnerable to being outdrawn, in order to protect your calling range. Tip number 3 is to defend wide against small bets. Sometimes, especially against very studied players who have studied game theory optimal strategies, they will bet really tiny, like 2 big blinds into the 14 big blind pot on the flop. Against really tiny bets like this, you're going to be getting excellent pot odds. And getting excellent pot odds, you cannot fold much of anything that has any potential whatsoever. Yes, sometimes you're going to be against a strong hand and you were barely getting the right price, even though you were getting 7-1 pot odds. But you need to be sticking around. Not quality, I can't type. QALIF, qualify. Overcards with any sort of backdoor equity at all definitely qualify, even if it's just like backdoor straight draw or something like that. Also, you're going to want to raise more often against small bets because when your opponent bets tiny, it's almost like they're checking. By the way, when your opponent does bet tiny, it's usually going to be on somewhat uncoordinated boards or boards where they have a little bit of an advantage, but not much, to the point that they want to bet with everything. When they're betting with everything, they will naturally have a lot of medium strength hands. And against medium strength hands, raising is a pretty strong strategy, especially with hands that don't especially want to call, because that puts them in a really nasty spot with a lot of their medium strength hands, which is a really good thing for you. Speaking of raising, let's discuss which hands you almost always want to be raising with, especially from out of position. You're going to want to be check raising with a polarized range. A polarized range means either your best hands or your junky hands. Now, junky hands is perhaps not necessarily the correct term because these junky hands will lack showdown value, but they will have some equity. These are going to be your draws. Okay? So you want to be check raising with the best hands in your range that are vulnerable to being outdrawn. This is going to be stuff like weak 2 pairs, over pairs, and strong top pairs, like top pair, top kicker, top pair, second kicker, top pair, third kicker. These hands are usually good enough, especially as stacks start to get shallow, to check raise and get the money in. You're also going to want to be raising with your strong draws, like flush draws with an overcard or backdoor straight draw or straight draw, right? These are hands you're going to check raise with and not fold. If your opponent wants to put their money in, it's not great, you don't love it, but that's okay. And finally, you're going to want to check raise it with a few junky draws. These are going to be hands like the backdoor nut flush draw or backdoor second nut flush draw. Maybe a gut shot straight draw. These are hands that are not loving the idea of checking and calling out of position. But if you check raise and your opponent folds, great. And if they shove it all in, well, then you can just fold because you don't have much of anything. So these are excellent hands to put in a check raise with. And by doing this, your opponent will not know if you have a really good made hand that's happy getting the money in, a strong draw that's also happy enough getting the money in, or a junky hand that has a little bit of equity if called, but will fold if re-raised. Tip number 5 is to give up when you have junk. When you call a 3-bet and flop totally nothing on the flop, check folding is fine. This will very often be the case with hands like Ace X suited, the weak ones. Say you raise Ace 5 suited, someone 3-bets, you call, and the flop comes Jack 8-7, and you have no flush draw or backdoor flush draw. Maybe if you have a backdoor flush draw. If you check and your opponent bets even tiny, like 2 or 3 big lines, you need to get out of the way if you don't have the backdoor flush draw. If you check and your opponent bets big, like let's say 8 big blinds into the 14 big blind pot, or if they bet even bigger, like the size of the pot, which is not a good play, but some people will, just fold. Just fold, 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 get out of the way. This is especially true when the flop is excellent for your opponent's range, meaning high cards and uncoordinated flops. Because remember, they have a lot of the best, strong, highest cards in their range, and you do not. In that scenario, you need to be very quick to fold. Say you have 9-8. 9-8 suited. You raise, they 3-bet, you call. The flop comes King, Queen, Jack, giving you a backdoor flush draw and a gut shot straight draw to the bad end. If you check and your opponent bets medium, fold. Why? Even though you have some backdoor equity and a gut shot? Well, first off, if you make the straight, there's no guarantee you're going to get paid off, and your opponent could easily just have an ace, king, queen, jack, 10, right? Your opponent's going to keep betting on the turn a lot because they just have a lot of really strong hands on the king, queen, jack board. So recognize that all, call them draws, are not the same, and if the board is really good for your opponent, you need to bail out early. Tip number 6 is when the flop checks, you're usually going to want to bet. Many players will bet the flop with all of their best hands. They just do it, they're afraid to let it check through, and they want to get money in the pot. So, when they check, it's very safe to assume they do not have a strong hand. And if they don't have a strong hand, it means they probably have a medium hand or a weak hand. And if the best hand your opponent can have is medium, and the best hand you could have is strong, because remember, you're going to check with a lot of stuff on the flop, this is a scenario where you want to be betting very frequently. When your opponent weakens their range, especially if they weaken it a lot based on their general tendencies, because you know they don't slow play very often, this is a sign for you to bet the turn and maybe even bet the river using a big size to try to put maximum pressure on their middle pairs and worse, which will be a lot of the hands that they are going to have in their range. Tip number 7 is to check it back when you have some showdown value. Let's say you raise the cutoff, the small blind 3 bets, and you call. Let's say you have pocket 9s. Say it comes king, queen, 5, and your opponent checks. This is a great spot just to check it back. Yes, you're somewhat vulnerable to being outdrawn. Notice any ace, 10, jack, maybe a random low card, who knows, is not good for you. But if you bet and get called, it's not great at all. Your opponent's going to have either 2 over cards with a straight draw or a king or a queen. And if they have nothing, they're going to fold, but their nothing usually only has 3 outs. So you're going to find that when you have a marginal made hand, these bets are usually, or these hands are usually good if 1 bet goes into the pot, but they're rarely good if 3 bets go into the pot. So check it back. And if they check to you on the turn, check it again. If they check to you on the river, check it again. If they can't call with many worse hands, for example, like say you do have the pocket 9s on the king, queen, 5, 2, jack, check, 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 check. You're going to win. Maybe they river to jack against you sometimes. Check it down. They win you win, you lose, whatever. Keep the pot small with your medium strength showdown value hands. To be fair, on king, queen, 5, if you have a hand like queen 9 suited, check it back on the flop. If they check the turn, check it again. The river's the jack. If they check, now you probably want to value bet. If they check 2 times, you can be pretty sure your queen is good and you can value bet the river. But that's another example where check, 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 right? If the river's an ace, check it back. With medium strength hands, check it back and get to the showdown cheaply. Do not think you just have to bet because your hand is probably good. You need to be good more than half the time when you get called, accounting for the fact that also sometimes you're going to get raised after you bet on the turn or river, which is really, really bad for you. Next, you're going to want to adjust your strategy based on the bet sizing your opponents use. I know I've talked about this a lot, but it is a really important point. As the bet you face is smaller, you must call way more often. If they bet 2 big blinds into 14, you got to stick around a lot. And also you need to raise more often. As the base you face is larger, you're going to want to call and raise less often, which means you're going to want to fold way more often. If your opponent 3 bets pre-flop and then pots it on the flop, you need to be folding a lot. If your opponent uses a specific bet size with a specific type of hand, you're going to want to adjust logically. You'll find that some players on the flop, whenever they flop top pair, top kicker, or better, they pot it. And when they have middle pair or worse, they bet 20% pot. Well, when they pot it, fold almost everything unless you can beat top pair, top kicker, right? But if they bet 20% pot, you're going to want to either call or raise that flop bet a ton. And then probably try to steal the pot on the turn or river if your opponent plays it in a obviously weak manner, because they probably don't have anything. Or if they do have something that's marginal. If your opponents play so poorly to the point that they telegraph the strength of their hand, and they will play it as you expect them to play it, meaning if they have middle pair or worse and they bet the turn and you raise, or they check the turn and you pot it and they're going to fold, and you know they're going to fold, these pots are free for you to take. I realize it takes knowing your opponent decently well, but we are playing poker and you get to figure out what your opponent is doing, especially in the small and medium stakes games against players who are not very well studied. They very often will play in a manner that allows you to steal a lot of these pots that are really free for the taking. You just have to be paying attention and be willing to get out of line to collect them. Tip number 9 is to be very cautious multi-way. As more players see the flop, you must proceed with caution because someone is likely to flop something as more and more people see the flop. And if it's not you, it's going to be someone else. And this is even more true in 3-bet pots and multi-way pots where the ranges should be strong in general because your opponents are going to have a lot of pairs in their hand, right? So if they have a lot of pocket pairs and a lot of good, strong high cards, they're just going to have something on a lot of flops, which means when you have nothing, just check fold. Do not get overly committed with bottom pair or an under pair or a junky draw. Just get out of the way early because you are against multiple strong ranges. So many people think that because a hand is strong heads up that it is strong 4 ways, but that is not the case, especially in 3-bet pots. And tip number 10 is to bluff when you have the range advantage. Sometimes the board is going to run out very nicely for you. And when the board runs out very nicely for you, you need to be applying pressure. When your range is favored over your opponents, you need to be sure to find lots of bluffs because you will also naturally have a whole lot of logical value bets. Let's consider a spot where you raise the cutoff, big blind 3 bets, you call in the cutoff. Flop comes 8-7-3, 2 hearts. Big blind continuation bets, let's say 10 big blinds into the 20 big blind pot, you call. Let's say we're playing about 60 big blinds deep. The turn's an 8, they check. This is a great spot for the cutoff to bet because the big blind, like we said, is going to have a lot of random unpaired high cards. If they have king, queen, queen, jack, stuff like that, ace X, they're going to fold to a 10 big blind bet into the 40 big blind pot. Only a 25% pot bet, they're going to fold out a ton of the time. Say they call them, as they will with maybe decent ace X and better. Say the river's the jack of hearts. If they check, this is an excellent spot for the cutoff to have lots of bluffs because they also have a lot of flushes, straights, trips, etc. So because the cutoff can easily go all in for half pot with trips and better in this spot, and they will have a lot of it, they also have the opportunity to bluff with pretty much any hand that can't win at the showdown in this scenario, and there's not a whole lot the opponent can do about it because if you consider the opponent's range, well, they probably would have bet a lot of their flush draws on the turn, so they don't really have many flushes. They probably bet 10-9 on the turn if they had it, so they don't really have that either. They don't have a whole lot of 8s to begin with because they 3-bet pre-flop, so your range in the cutoff just demolishes their range because sort of the best thing they can have here is pocket aces, and a lot of people keep betting aces on the turn too, so they can't have anything. And if they can't have anything and you can have a lot of nuts, you in turn get to have a whole lot of river bluffs. So do not be afraid to bluff when you have the range and nut advantage. So that's it for today. A jam-packed video with 10 tips for playing in 3-bet pots when you are the pre-flop caller. Hope you enjoyed this video. Do me a favor before you leave. Click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell because I and a lot of other coaches are making great content here on mypokercoaching.com YouTube channel, and I want to make sure that you do not miss out. Good luck in your games. Have fun, and I'll talk to you next time.